My guest today is Mikey Ramirez, Mikey Ramirez Films, a videographer here down in Southern California who does absolutely beautiful work and a really great guy. Hope you enjoy it. My name is Brian Franklin. I am the co-founder of Vows Speeches, where we help people write and practice personalized custom vows, wedding speeches, ceremony scripts, and all of the speaking parts for any kind of event. If you or someone you know needs help with one of these things, please reach out to vowsandspeeches.com. That's VOWSAND speeches.com, or you can email me directly at Brian, BRIAN, at vowsandspeeches.com. Today is Mikey Ramirez of Mikey Ramirez Films. I've gotten to know Mikey at various events here, networking events here in Southern California. He's one of my favorite people in the business. I really enjoy him. Someone that has been rocketing into a new level of service, into the luxury, or at least highly upscale. Wedding pros don't always like the word luxury, but I think it means something. But at any rate, he's in more and more demand as every day goes by because he does beautiful work. I've seen it, and he's just a pleasure to be around. Welcome, Mikey. Thank you for joining me, and that's great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a long-awaited episode for us for sure. I know we've been talking about this for a
Yeah,
while now, and so it's good to be here, man.
yeah, great. I apologize again for my hoarse voice this time. I don't know what happened, but so at any rate, Mikey, how long have you been in videography?
Yeah, so from like a hobby standpoint, I've been doing, let's see, I'm 32 now. I started really when I was about 14, 15, so 16, 17 years, something around there. As a hobby, I've always really been passionate about storytelling and all that stuff. I was the kid that I'm like 10 or 11 years old and I'm watching films from Hollywood and I'm like pouring my eyes out, crying in my room because of the story and the depth behind it. So it's where YouTube started becoming a big thing. I loved making the skits and things like that. But professionally, we're on year nine now, which feels really crazy. It's pretty much the year that I started wanting to pursue it as a career, started looking for jobs and building my skill sets and things like that. So yeah, as a hobby, 16, 17 years, and as a business, about 9 years.
So in those years, I'm sure you've seen many different kinds of weddings and ceremonies and different versions of people's vows. Let's start with the good part. What have you seen that sticks out at you over all this experience? What are the things have made for really beautiful moments, particularly as you wind up editing them later on?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say couples are becoming a lot more intentional behind, and I don't know if it's just because this is the brand that I've built and I've done a great, amazing job at educating clients. Maybe I hope so. Maybe it's a little too much credit, but one thing I've noticed over the years is couples now they're really wanting something more particular and based on their desires, their visions, their goals, their dreams. And so I'm starting to see more of a market for that where couples are really interested in making sure everything that is in accordance with their wedding is all in tune with the vision that they have. That's what I'm noticing now. Whereas before,
Hyper personalization, essentially.
yeah, hyper personalization. They want everything to reflect their unique perspectives. They want everything to be, yeah, like in tune with their experience in life and their personalities. And so I'm seeing a lot less people wanting to settle for this sort of stereotypical wedding or the traditional wedding. Still lots of traditional aspects. I would say most of our couples tend to have that traditional aspect, but they want it to be just a little bit extra, right? They wanted to have their personality behind it. So that's what I would say. But that's one thing that I've noticed over the years is that yeah, they just want it to be unique.
How are they putting that into practice? What are some of the examples, perhaps, that stick out of that kind of personalization or that additive factor that shows them as a personality or as a couple?
Yeah, so like I said, I can only speak for myself and in our process. And the big thing that we do is I always want to try to give couples language, like the right language for them to use, because they come to me with ideas and concepts, but they don't quite know how to use the verbiage or use the right types of words. I actually, this past year, I changed I don't call myself a videographer anymore. I call myself the curator of dreams. And I love that because that's always been important to me in my life has been, I want to have a well-defined vision of my life, and I want it to be proper. I want it to be well designated. And I think if I'm answering your question, I think that couples are starting to see that more wedding pros are starting to look more like help the couples find the right verbiage. And especially with what you guys do, you want it to be interpersonal for them and you want to give them the right terms. And that's what I found is that couples are really have a hard time finding the right verbiage for the vision that they have. And I think that now that wedding pros like us are getting more privy to that and knowing the side of education that's important to educate our couples, it's opening up this world for unique design.
Yeah, I was talking with a wedding planner the other day, and because everybody wants this kind of personalization, or not everybody, but because of a certain kind of crowd, the crowd that gravitates to us
Mhm.
wants that kind of personalization. It extends across the entirety of the wedding. It's not just the verbiage, it's the ceremony, it's the vows, it's the design that reflects their tastes. It's the little choices, whether it's how the food is presented to perhaps extracurricular activities that are extensions of their as a couple and their personality and the things that they like and their values and all of that stuff. And certainly for us, we aim to do the opposite of the stereotypical ceremony or the
Yeah.
stereotypical set of vows. We want people to show themselves in a certain way, and we
Mhm.
ask the kinds of questions that get the answers that allow us to do that and help them get to what they really want to say and didn't even know how to put it together
Yeah.
in that way. But that's the art, that's the artistry of what we try and do. That's the artistry of what you do when you're looking at the back end product, because I know process wise, you film the whole thing and then you've got to go through all the footage and not just record it and not just present it back to them, but also often there's a highlight reel and you're putting it to music and you're making movies out of this thing. When you're doing that, what are the kinds of things that you ask them ahead of time to make sure that what you're presenting back to them is, if not exactly what they want, then at least close enough to edit well and easy.
Yeah, so for me, it's a conversation. I like questions like, and this is the secret sauce, but I love questions like, especially in the initial discovery phase, which I feel like most of us are always doing, but doesn't necessarily mean people are going to book. But one of the questions that I really love is, what is a wedding film going to do for you? And that really starts to get them thinking because what is it? And first of all, I want to get behind the motivation as I don't want to spend my time trying to convince people why it's important to hire us. I want to get behind the motivation and they share. It's a tidbit that I got from Chris Voss, his book, Never Split the Difference,
Yeah,
where
it's a
he's like,
great book.
you want to ask the right questions and then you want to shut up and then you want to let them talk. And so those are in my perspective is because I want to at the end of the day, once all is said and done, I want to provide something that is so unique to them. Of course, every wedding has similarities, every wedding has all that, but even in the similarities, how can we create something that's so unique to them that when they watch it, they really truly feel like it embodies who they are? Like I said, one of those questions I like to ask is, what is a wedding film going to do for you? What does it mean to you? What's your idea in a perfect world of a wedding film? What stands out to you? And then I just want to hear them talk. And as they
Yeah.
talk, I'm taking notes. I'm looking for key indicators of like key terms. Like recently, there was a couple calls where one of them talked, all they talked about was the moments. All they talked about was the family, the unique relationship dynamics. And literally, like a call the next day, they were talking about the florals and the colors and how everything was going to be. So that right then and there, to me, indicates okay, for this film, we're going to have more florals, we're going to have more design, more decor. That's most important to them.
Yeah.
And so I think I've been doing it so long, sometimes it's hard to put into words, but I, in a like very subconscious way, am taking these things into consideration. And that's when I start like looking for the right music. I want to start looking for the right things that are going to really have a proper undertone to the overarching narrative that they're looking for.
How much communication? I know that in many cases we get hired we'll get hired by one of the couple, maybe both of the couple sometimes. It depends on if we're doing the ceremony, it depends on if both of them need help with their vows. But occasionally someone will hire us and they don't want anyone else to know that they're getting help because they think that there's a stigma to it, but there isn't. But
Mhm.
they think they're worried about that for some reason or another. And we try and convince them out of it because it really does really are using their words and their thoughts and their stories to get there and just helping them put it together. But at any rate, when we get to a certain point, we've collected so much information about them by the time we're done with these interviews. Unfortunately, at this stage, a lot of our work gets done way late in the process, way beyond the design process, sometimes just before the wedding itself, right?
Yeah.
And perhaps too late for most wedding vendors to make use of that information. But what I haven't seen a lot of, and maybe you have, is sharing that information amongst the wedding planners and design. You know, like if we're already asking some of the same questions, I spend an hour-long interview with them and I'm treating it like a scavenger hunt for
Mhm.
stories and ideas, personality, and things like that. But I think in a perfect world, it would be useful for there to be more collaboration between us and videographers and us and the designers because we are hearing little aspects of their relationship that might translate to something, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you
And
seen that kind of collaboration before, really?
yeah, so I'm trying to get better into it, but the one of the things that we've relied on, and I tell this to every couple, but one of the things that we relied on is, and I just had a call. It was a couple, they just booked us like yesterday actually, but it was a call a few days ago, and the planner was also in the call. And one thing that I told the couple is exactly what I just told you was like, we asked the questions, what's your vision going to be like? What is it going to look like? But I tell her, because we get asked a lot, like, what about the music choices? Like, where do you get your music from? Like, how do you choose the music? Do we get any input on the music? And I tell them this exact same thing. I say, you can give us ideas. Like if there's an artist that you really, we might not be able to use their music unless you have $20,000 for licensing fees. We probably can't use it. But if you give me like an idea of a good artist, like there's tools now that we can use, find licensed music through AI or something like that. We just
Mhm.
type in the name and we get different options that are similar. But I tell them all the time, I say, even with all of these questions that I'm asking, nobody knows what your wedding's going to actually be like. Nobody knows. And so that's why with my team, I've
Great
trained them
point.
to be, yeah, I've trained them to be real, like emotionally intelligent, to really pay attention to the dynamic of the family. And I use this example all the time. How do people, when you walk into the room, how do people respond to you? What is the response they have? Is it excited? Is it maybe like scared or nervous? Do you make them anxious? Things like that. These are real things that people don't realize, right?
Yeah,
So I'm always looking for what is actually happening throughout the day. What does the day end up looking like? And I tell them afterward, that's when the creative process of finding the right music, finding the right dialogue, all that stuff comes, at least for us from a videographer standpoint.
yeah,
But to your point, I do think that it's really important for planners, designers, photographers, florists to, I don't know what that would look like, but maybe come into more of a circular conversation of, hey, what did they tell you? What information did they give you? What did you get from this person in terms of their personality and their style? And
yeah.
have he as a bigger collaborator, like you said, bigger
Yeah,
collaborator.
because if somebody really has been, for whatever reasons, very difficult or things are going wrong and they're coming into their wedding and they're about to do the processional and they were a wreck emotionally,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's gonna show, right?
yeah.
They're gonna see it, right?
Yeah.
And then they gotta do their vows. It's it's the same thing with the audience. Like some of those people had a bad day already. They already got a fight in the way on the way to the wedding. You're
Yeah.
gonna have to do something to keep this thing moving. So what have you seen? Let's talk about some of the bad things that you've seen that
Sure.
whether in ceremonies or in let's start with ceremonies and vows. What are the things that didn't go as planned or should have gone a whole lot better?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is couples that find generic vows because they feel like they need to do them. That's one of the most, at least from a creative standpoint and an editing standpoint, when I have to tell that story, there's times where I'm like, man, I don't know if I can use this. And I have to really like a scientist go in or like a doctor, I really got to go in and cut the little pieces and it's just like the tone isn't right. And I'm like, how am I supposed to use this? And in those situations, I might switch because maybe the couple's a more sarcastic couple, for example. I might use more of their vows in like a fun part of the film rather
Hmm.
than something soft and smooth and
Yeah.
cinematic or whatever. So yeah, I've seen things like that where they'll find just some generic vows on a website somewhere, just some templated chat
Chat
GPT
GPT.
thing.
Yeah,
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 and you're just like, there's no life, there's no perspective, there's no philosophy behind what you're saying.
yeah,
You're just saying it because you felt like you needed to do this because I don't know, for whatever reason. I think a lot of couples they follow the traditions because they feel like they need to, when that's just not, you don't need to. Like this is your
yeah.
way.
And our process through the interview is to get them to a point where they don't have to look up anything. They've already said it. It's just something, it's just where do you put it together? What's funny about you? What's great about you, right? But what's great about them? What makes you laugh? What's challenging?
Mhm.
What do you have to what do they have to put up with and what do you have to put up with? And but that's where the fun is. And but I think a lot of couples think that they've seen weddings before and they just lacking no lacking an understanding of what they should do. That's a fallback that they can accept because that's what they've seen it before. What they don't realize is that it just doesn't sound authentic at all.
Yeah.
And and that the hard part about filling out a questionnaire, even where you can generate it in some form or fashion, is you're asking people that are not necessarily writers or good at articulating their feelings to then answer questions that require them to write and articulate their feelings. So,
Yeah.
but beyond saying generic things, have you heard people say things that upset the force at all?
For sure. Yeah, there was one, I remember there was one speech in particular. This was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was just a lot of like sarcastic remarks. It was just, the joke was, it was so at the expense of the groom or vice versa. And I remember there was one wedding where that had happened and it was everybody was drinking. By the way, this person had this speech written out. Like it was written. So it had in mind that he was going to just completely
Yeah,
demolish the groom or whatever. And so that just threw things off. And I remember I had given them the full speeches and they were like, we don't really want groomsmen that gave that speech. They were like, we don't want that in the film, and we don't even really want it as a cut, as an edit, because that just does not represent like who we are at all. And it was
yeah.
true; they were right. And I think at the time, like I wasn't quite there yet with my process. That I was just like, I'm just going to give this to them just to be nice or whatever, and they just didn't even want it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's things like that we've experienced in terms of the vows. I think the vows have generally been pretty kind and pretty thoughtful, but yeah, I think with the speeches, that's where you can get some real dangerous territory.
I just answered a press inquiry where I was responding, I think it was to a Reddit thing, and about someone who had to listen to a speech that was essentially it was a roast without the
Yeah.
humor. And without the resolution. It's one thing to tease lightly in a non-damaging way. And it's another thing to inflict damage that you could have guessed was going to be damaging at some level to the
Yeah.
person, and then not resolve it, not bring it around to they're the best person ever or whatever. Like you've got to do that at your own expense, not theirs ultimately. Even the roasts on Comedy Central, they always end with something nice. They're always like, this is all in good fun. And the person knew they were being roasted. That's why they
Yeah.
went there. They're doing it for charity, right?
Yeah.
This is a wedding,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like you're in a wedding. This is not the purpose of this. But I think with the vows, the thing that people get into trouble with when they do get into trouble is they either go too short or too long, or they say something that might be something you say in private or in a small group, but not something particularly great for when your grandparents are in the audience or your work friends and that sort of thing. So it's a different kind of humor that you have to do when you're up there. What's the shortest speech you can remember?
The shortest speech, man, that's a good question. I think I'm more, when you say that, my mind goes more to the quickest ceremony because usually
Okay.
the ceremonies that are the quickest tend to be the ones with the quickest vows. And I just had one recently. The vows weren't short really, but I had one recently where they did the vows right up front before I had time to like really make sure all my cameras were set up. So that part was weird. I think I've had more grooms, for example, where they're just like the bride's vows just completely dwarf like whatever the
There's an
groom,
imbalance. Yeah.
the complete imbalance. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that's more of like an issue that I've seen.
Couples really need to talk to each other about
Yeah.
how long they want it to be and how long each of theirs are. And
Yeah.
they need to say them out loud and time them because it's
Yeah.
not, people look at copy and they don't know how long it is by
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
at it. They just can't.
Some of the ones that I've seen where they're just rambling. They're like, there's
Yeah,
no
they're
real
winging it.
direction.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's no real direction to the story. There's no real, like you said earlier, there's no real resolution. There's nothing, there's no arc in the story or
yeah.
whatever. It means it's just like multiple different stories from, whatever experience they had. And a lot of people, they don't really want to
What
sit
do
through
you
that.
think it should be in terms of, let's go back to length for a second and we'll come back to, we'll go to arc. But how long do you think a ceremony should be, the ceremony narrative? How long do you feel as someone, especially as someone that edits them and sees them all the time, how long do you think the best vows should be or are
I would say, man, if it depends on how well they're done. I think if they're done really well, I don't think you need more than 2.5, 3 minutes for
for the
vows.
vow?
And
Yeah.
that's already kind of a long time.
Yeah.
But I think at the maximum 2.5, 3 minutes.
Yeah, we suggest 1 to 2 minutes. So usually 2 minutes is where we land,
Yeah.
and that's perfect. We've done three when they really insist, or the story demands it. There are times where you get so much good material, and you're dealing with somebody that can deliver it a certain way that it's perfect.
Yeah.
But what about the ceremony itself? Like putting aside the vows, what about the first part where the person gets up there and talks about the relationship?
Yeah, I think they talk a little bit too much. And I think that whoever is officiating the wedding, generally it's like a family friend or like a pastor that they've been raised by for so many years or something. And so they're a little bit too personal. And so I think that those people tend to think that they have just full reign because they're so connected emotionally, relationally, that they're just like, okay, I'm going to talk about all these experiences that I had when you were such a little kid and you were so
Yeah,
funny and this and that. Is I get the sentiment, and it's the same thing with speeches sometimes where people just ramble and they feel like they almost make it about themselves. And it's not their wedding, they're just officiating. So I would say to give you like just a generic sort of thing, I don't think ceremonies really should be more than 15 minutes. Like 15
yeah.
minutes, 20 minutes, like maximum. There's no real need for all that.
100% agree. You're often dealing with people in the sun, right?
Yeah.
They're sitting out there, they want a cocktail. In a great ceremony, people are excited to listen. They're getting
Mhm.
excited about this whole thing. Time goes by fast. You love it. And that's great. But when it's not great, when it's generic, when
Mhm.
it's overly personal, like to the point of they're making it about themselves and it's not about the couple and the couple's story. And I think there's a little bit of personal references you can make where establish your position as someone of authority to speak
Mhm.
on these matters about them. That's fine. But beyond that, it's about the couple and how
Yeah.
they met and how what they love and how this thing went and why we're here. And maybe if you're in a relationship, maybe then you can give a little bit of advice, a tiny bit, but appropriate advice. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Not none of the cliched stuff either. Don't pull out this is the last time you're going to have the upper hand cliche kind of thing. I had an officiant once that was so terrified to do this that like it was he could barely get the words out, right? Just in practicing with me.
Mhm.
Ultimately, he did a wonderful job. But couples also have to understand that it the person that you're asking may have no skills in this regard and
Yeah.
no experience doing this and may
Yeah.
not know how to work a crowd,
Mhm.
right? Or hold a microphone even, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's when you get to the point of speeches as a videographer, talk to me about technique. What are the delivery technique things that you like to see? I think we all agree that you shouldn't hold a phone, right?
Yeah.
Do it off a piece of paper. Memorizing can be perilous. That's a problem. You can get up there thinking you've memorized it and then stand there like trying to figure it out. But what are some of the other things that you like to see from a speech standpoint that makes for good video?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, because you don't want to put that pressure. Like, I do a lot of public speaking and I don't like timers. Timers really freak me out. Like, they really stress me out.
Really?
But you want, like, when I'm giving speeches or when I'm speaking, I actually like to have bullet points. I used to be the person who would write every single thing down. This is how I want it to flow. And that was just too much too. So I like the bullet points. I like to make them quick and I like to give myself reminders of, okay, this bullet point is 30 seconds, 45 seconds or whatever. But I want it to like kind of flow. And I'm sure you walk with couples or bridesmaids through this or groomsmen, but one thing that I love to see is you want to create Actually, at least the fun ones that I've seen, the really great ones. Because especially dads, for some reason, they have the hardest time where they go on for 30 minutes. But one of the things that I like to see is an introduction to like the couple and your guys' relationship together and who you are. Not the whole, if nobody knows me, my name is whatever, because we hear that
Yeah,
all the time. But I love it when there's sort of sections within where it's, of course, an introduction, but then where you talk about like how, I don't know, how the couple inspires you, how you've loved to see how they've grown together and their relationship and the dynamic. But oftentimes, the things that I don't like to see and the ones that I can rarely use when I'm editing are the ones when they're just talking about themselves. I've heard so many speeches where they're like, in 10th grade or in college, this had happened to me, and my life was so terrible and miserable, but I'm so grateful that you were there. And they
yeah,
turn like the therapy session. Those are the ones I really dislike. But the ones where it's funny, it's you're entertaining the crowd in a certain way, but you're also the stories are meaningful and there's just a circular narrative of we're here to celebrate these two.
yeah.
Um,
Going back to your point about bullets, I don't recommend that people use bullets
okay.
in this situation because first of all, it's one thing when you're doing public speaking about your work
Yeah.
or something you speak to regularly,
Mhm.
but this is a very specific moment where you have, let's say, 3 to 4 minutes. And in those 3 to 4 minutes, you have a lot of things to accomplish, but you want every word to be beautiful
Mhm.
and you want to get through them with some flow. To me, I think when people work off of bullets, they're still thinking about what they have to say next, and that changes the rhythm of what they do.
Mhm.
More than that, I think it's also an invitation to not know how long you're going to go. And so by writing literally everything out, you do a few different things. First of all, you get through the muscle memory piece of it. You speak it out loud. It's not just about knowing the material, it's about speaking the material physically, right?
Mhm.
And that's not for someone like me, for example, I need to do that. I trip over
Mhm.
words, right? And so if I don't practice the material, I will trip on it at some
Mhm.
point, especially if I'm trying to think about it while I'm doing it.
Mhm.
And so you get the muscle memory, that's one piece of it. You can then also figure out, did I write some things that are bad word combinations for speaking? Sometimes you get a few words together. It's not a great sound or you have trouble with it. So you
Mhm.
can edit those things out. You can also decide if it sounds too formal. Before I send a script to a client, I will read it out loud and I will time it. That's another thing. You make sure that it is on time. But I also sometimes will rewrite and put contractions where I didn't. So instead of saying we will, I'll go will or your. And it just has more of a casual flow to it. It is more like speaking than writing.
Yeah.
Because it looked good on paper. I didn't even think about it. But then as soon as I said it, it's no one would say it that way, really.
Yeah.
And then so you can edit that kind of stuff out. But also, I think having enough familiarity and flow and practice with it, even if you don't memorize it, you get it well enough to where you can start doing eye contact. And that's when you can reference and start the sentence, perhaps, but finish it looking at the person that you're talking to.
Yeah.
And I think when you're doing bullets, that might be possible, and some people can do it,
I can
but
do it. I can do
you
it.
can do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think also a lot of people think they can do it, and it doesn't turn out quite as well as they could have if they had written it out and
Right.
practiced it straight through.
I think the writing it out and practicing it beforehand is a super cool touch and I think really important. I think what I find most of the time is people who don't do that and they write everything out and all they do is they're just looking down reading the whole thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you have to practice. That's
Yeah.
just the bottom line. You can't do any of this.
Yeah.
You shouldn't wing it, and you should always practice
Right.
because that's where you're going to get the flow. That's where you're going to get the eye contact. That's
Mhm.
where you get to concentrate on your delivery so that you're not sounding like you're reading a word. There's a certain cadence when you read something for the first time. You're reading it word by word,
Mhm.
literally, right?
Mhm.
You like literally. And then when you've read it the fifth or 10th time or 20th time out loud, you're not reading it the same way. You're reading
Yeah.
phrases, you're reading sentences, you might be reading paragraphs, and it just comes out a different way.
Yeah.
And again, it's like some people can do it off the cuff. There are people that can wing it and do it beautifully, but they
Mhm.
are far outnumbered by the people that think they can that
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, Mikey, you've been in Southern California the whole time? You grew up here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Born and raised.
And now you're working, but you're starting to work elsewhere, right? You're starting to do destination stuff.
Yeah, I would say relatively here and there. Last year we were in France doing some stuff with some bridal designers, and then we've done a couple places, Tennessee, Michigan. But yeah, primarily, yeah, Southern California is our stomping ground. So
But,
yeah.
but at the right budget, if someone's listening to this in New York and they like your style, you're open to it.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we're getting a lot of couples that are East Coast couples, a lot of couples from Texas that are actually having destination weddings here. I don't want to. I think they tend to find my style a lot more pleasing and a little bit more in line with that culture. And so if I was going to go to New York right now, like I'd probably do really well. So yeah, we get a lot of our clients are actually from the East Coast.
Yeah.
They're just having their weddings here in Southern California. So.
So you're also a musician, and you mentioned something earlier that I'd like to come back to because I think a lot of couples don't understand that this is even a thing. When you're doing a wedding video and you hand it to them, there is licensing involved. There are blanket licenses that you can buy and use for certain purposes and whatnot. If you want your favorite song on a video, you can't just have it,
Right.
and you can't have it in part because they may publish their wedding video, or they're expected that they will.
Yeah, it definitely gets funny with like legalities. One thing that I've known is that if we include unlicensed music that we're selling, that could be like us selling as if we own it. And so there could be some like legal ramifications there because we don't own the rights to the song. And so the music industry is very aggressive when it comes to getting their money.
Right.
If I might get into a huge lawsuit if somebody finds out, or they might get into, I don't really know how it works. It's never happened to me. I've always been very careful about it.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But it's
they're
also likely if they were to grab their, and this could happen even if you license it, but if you took your wedding highlight video that had music on it that is appropriately licensed and you put it on YouTube, their own copyright detection things could click in and say, you don't own the rights to this music
yeah.
to publish it anywhere else on the internet, essentially. So
Yeah.
that's part of the difficulties when it comes to having this stuff and sharing it.
Yeah, there's too much risk involved, and most of the time, like on YouTube, you'll just get marked. You'll lose your YouTube channel if you do it enough times, and
Yeah.
that for a lot of people is like another source of revenue, and they're not willing to risk that. But yeah, it gets really legally funny. There are ways to license the music. There are ways to go through it, and I've told couples this, but it's even going to cost money just to make the attempt to try to license a certain song
Sure.
because there's a lot of
It's time. It's
yeah,
yeah.
it's a lot of
Um,
time, a lot of research, a lot of hoops you have to jump through, and
yeah.
sometimes it's just not worth it.
Yeah. And for those times where you decide, okay, I'm not going to go that route, there is a plethora of available and license-free music out there and original music too. There's people that can be hired to conceive a soundtrack to something if you really insisted. It's an interesting quirk of this whole thing. I always am fascinated to hear how couples navigate their musical choices just as a relationship. I can only imagine the difficulty that DJs and videographers have when
Yeah.
there's a couple that wants to personalize their video, but they
Yeah.
don't share the same taste in music. Do you run into that?
Yeah, not so much with the music part. I think because most of the time we're dealing with the bride. Grooms are rarely in the process, but even if they are, or
Yeah.
maybe like once a year we'll get a groom that's I get on a call with. But most of the time they're just really interested in what I shoot on. They just care more about the camera bodies and the creative side of things and like my
Yeah.
process. Whereas like the brides, they're really more interested in just the emotion. They just want to know that they feel understood and they feel heard. And the grooms, they just care about the tech, which is funny.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny. I gotta tell you, I got married 8 years ago before I was in the wedding industry. Ironically, our friend Robin Ballard was our wedding planner at the time and at an earlier point in her career. But we did not hire a videographer. And it
Mhm.
was one of the biggest regrets I have now because some of those people, some of those guests are gone now. They're no longer living. And I wish I had video of them. I wish I had more. We were very lucky that a close friend of ours happened to videotape our kids' speeches on their phone. And they weren't like good videos, it was just we got the audio at least. And so we had that. And one of the speeches was a fantastic roast of me, by the way, that ended. She was 16 at the time, and my stepdaughter, and she really nailed it. And it was one of the things that we were thinking about when we started this business, because when we see people, they're like, that was such a fun wedding. And that speech, and it always comes back to that speech, which we thankfully have.
Mhm.
But the point here is hire a videographer and hire a great one like Mikey, because it will come back to you. You think, I'm not going to watch my wedding over and over again. Yes, you will. You
Yeah.
will. Downstream, you will for sure. And if nothing else, you're going to see some people in your video that you're going to miss. And
Yeah.
so it's something that everybody should think about. But it's also fun to see the young you doing your
Yeah.
thing, dancing away, and getting the artistry of it. Having somebody like Mikey who understands the importance of capturing your personality. It's such an important aspect of the wedding, and I just hope that all of you that might be listening will value that as much as I know Mikey and I do. Mikey, tell everybody how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, they can reach out on my website, my Instagram, social media. Mostly everything is Mikey R Films. So that's MIKEYR Films, MIKEYR Films. And they can find anything, my TikTok, my Instagram, YouTube, anything like that. But definitely reach out. You can send me an email. My email's on my website or on my Instagram, or just shoot me a DM and I'm there.
Thanks, Mikey. I appreciate you being here, and I will absolutely talk to you soon. If you need help with your vows, your wedding speech, or your ceremony script, you want to make it personal, you need some help practicing it, visit vowsandspeeches.com. That's VOWSAND speeches.com. You can reach out to me there. You can send me an email at Brian, BRIAN, at vowsandspeeches.com. But I'd love to help you.